Welcome back. In the previous video, we implemented an aiming state machine so that we could change the animation pose when we're aiming. In this video, we're going to take care of a small detail when it comes to aiming, and that's the look sensitivity. We want it to be lower while aiming so that it's easier to zero in on a target. Let's get started. In shooterCharacter.h, we're going to add some more private variables here. Now let's take a look here where we have our base turn rate and base lookup rate. We're now going to have some more variables based on whether or not we're aiming. So we'll basically have a turn rate and lookup rate for when our gun is at our hip, and another for when the gun is at the shoulder when we're aiming. So let's make a float and call this hip turn rate when we're hip firing. And we'll also make a float hip look up rate. And next we'll make a float for aiming called aiming turn rate. And of course a float called aiming look up rate. Now I'd like these to be visible anywhere, blueprint read only, just like base lookup rate and base turn rate. So let's copy those uProperty macros and give these all the same uProperties. And finally, we can comment these. For hip turn rate, I'm just going to say turn rate while not aiming. And same thing for hip lookup rate. I'm going to say look up rate when not aiming. For aiming turn rate, we'll say turn rate when aiming, and aiming look up rate when aiming. Now let's give these some default values in the constructor. All the way up here, just under zoom and terp speed, we'll go ahead and initialize these. Now I'll give these some values, but again, just like most of these can be tweaked based on your needs. So let's do hip turn rate, and I'm going to give this a value of 90.f. Hip look up rate, I'm going to make this also 90.f. And aiming turn rate, this is going to be much lower. Let's put it at about 20. Same thing for aiming look up rate. We'll give it about 20. And then I'm going to go ahead and just put a comment here for this part. These are the turn rates for aiming and not aiming. So I'll just put a quick comment saying turn rates for aiming / not aiming. In fact, we can comment these variables here for the camera zoom properties. We can say camera field of view values. And since these are all turn and look up rates, why don't we go ahead and put them up here next to base turn rate and base look up rate. Don't forget the comma here, and then we'll delete these from the bottom and also remove this last comma here. To be thorough, we can comment base turn rate and base lookup rate, and we'll say base rates for turning / looking up. Now when we're turning, basically using the arrow keys or the controller thumbstick, the right thumbstick, we use base turn rate. Well, we can change the base turn rate when we're aiming. Let's go ahead and go down to our tick function because we need to update this every frame. In the tick function, we can say if be aiming, then we can set our base turn rate to our aiming turn rate. So we'll say base turn rate equals aiming turn rate. And if we're not aiming, else, then we can set base turn rate to our hip turn rate. Now we can do the same thing for the look up rate. We can say if we're aiming, base look up rate equals aiming look up rate. And if we're not aiming, we can say base look up rate equals hip look up rate. Now just like with camera and terp zoom, this is starting to clutter up tick. So we can simply create a function and refactor this to take care of turning rates while aiming. So let's create a function just under our camera interp zoom function. So here it is in our .h file. And let's say void, and this is going to set our turn and look up rates based on aiming. So we can call this set look rates. And we're definitely going to need a comment for this one. Set base turn rate and base look up rate based on aiming. Let's let Visual Studio create a definition for us. And we'll simply take this logic we put in tick, copy that, and move it into our new function, set look rates. And we just need to call set look rates here in tick. And we'll say change look sensitivity based on aiming. Let's compile this. Okay, I'm back in the editor. I'm going to hit play, click in the viewport, and I'm going to just use my console controller, and I'm going to hit the left trigger. This is relatively how much look sensitivity I get, and then when I aim, looks like it's a little bit less look sensitive. Now, of course, we use these base turn rate and base lookup rate variables in the turn rate and lookup rate functions, which have nothing to do with the mouse. The mouse is still going to have the same look sensitivity. This only takes care of the ones that use a rate rather than an absolute value like for the mouse. So here's a challenge for you. I want you to try to figure out a way to decrease the look sensitivity for the mouse. Remember, we implement mouse turning in a slightly different way than we do for the turn rate functions, which use a button press like the arrow keys and the left thumbstick on the controller. And also, so pause the video and try to implement that and come back. Okay, so to affect our turn rate with the mouse, we have to remember how we implemented turning with the mouse. So let's go back to our code. And if we go to setup player input component, we'll see that in our bind axis function call, when we bind turn and look up, we're binding the functions add controller yaw input and add controller pitch input directly from the pawn class, which means whatever value we get in our mouse X and Y axis inputs is just passed straight into this. Well, we don't have to call this function directly. We can create our own function and alter that value as we see fit. So why don't we create functions for these which take float values as inputs? Let's go back to shooter character.h, and we'll go up here just under turn at rate and look up at rate, and we'll create a couple of functions. We'll create void turn. It'll take a float called value. And let's make a void function called look up. That'll take a float called value as well. Now we can put some comments on these. I'm going to use multi-line comments so we can explain the params a little bit. For turn, we're going to say rotate controller based on mouse X movement. And the parameter is called value. And let's describe this. We'll say the input value from mouse movement. We'll copy this comment and we'll put a similar comment for look up, but we're going to rotate controller based on mouse Y movement. So that looks good. Now let's go ahead and make a couple of definitions for these. And now in setup player input component, instead of calling the pawn function add controller yaw and pitch input respectively, we can call our function a shooter character turn. And for look up, it's going to be a shooter character look up. And now we just need to implement those functions. So let's find those, and here they are. Now we know we're ultimately going to call add controller pitch input for look up, and we're going to call add controller yaw input for turn. The question is, what do we scale the values by? We need the value to be less for turning while we're aiming and higher for when we're not aiming. So let's create variables that we can use for these. So let's go to the .h file. Let's go down to our private section with all our variables. Let's find our other variables here, the turn and lookup rates. And we need to distinguish between our other look rates and this one that will affect the mouse. So we're going to create these floats, and I'm going to call this one mouse hip turn rate. And I'll make one called mouse aiming turn rate. And then I'll have a float called mouse hip look up rate and float mouse aiming look up rate. And just to be consistent, it looks like up here we had the hip variables together and the aiming variables together. So I'm going to take the mouse hip lookup rate and put it just under mouse hip turn rate. And that way the two aiming variables are together and the two hip variables are together. Now all of these aiming rates might actually be good if we could edit them in our default blueprint. So why don't we go ahead and make the hip and aiming variables all editable from the blueprint, which would be edit defaults only. I'm going to make these all edit defaults only. And then our new variables, we can make those have the same U properties. So for mouse hip turn rate, we'll give it that same U property. Same for mouse hip look up rate. And mouse aiming turn rate and mouse aiming lookup rate. And we'll give these comments. For mouse hip turn rate, we're going to say scale factor for mouse look sensitivity turn rate when not aiming. And for mouse hip look up rate, it's going to say the same thing except scale factor for mouse look sensitivity look up rate when not aiming. And for mouse aiming turn rate, it'll say scale factor for mouse look sensitivity turn rate when aiming. And for mouse aiming lookup rate, it'll say scale factor for mouse look sensitivity look up rate when aiming. Now these are all descriptive. So now we've got these rates and we need to give them some values. Let's go back into our constructor up here, and just under our turn rates for aiming and not aiming, we're going to create another comment that says mouse look sensitivity scale factors, and we'll go ahead and give these default values. Mouse hip turn rate, mouse hip look up rate, so mouse aiming turn rate, and mouse aiming look up rate. So what values do we need? For the hip values, I'd say that this scale factor could be 1. Unless, of course, you want your mouse sensitivity to be a different value, maybe you want it lower. But we're going to use 1 for now. And for mouse aiming turn rate, let's put this at a lower value, something like 0.2f. 0.2f. Now we can see how this looks. And just to section off these 4 variables from B aiming, I'm going to comment B aiming and say true when aiming the weapon. So now we can go back into our turn and lookup functions. So now in turn, we need to check to see if we're aiming. So we're going to say if B aiming, and we'll have an else statement as well. Now, whether we're aiming or not, we're still going to call add controller yaw input for the turn function. So we're going to say add controller yaw input, and we're going to pass in the value scaled by something. What are we going to scale? Well, we can create a local variable here at the top called turn scale factor. And if we're aiming, we can set turn scale factor. Well, if we're aiming, we can set this to mouse aiming turn rate. There it is. Mouse aiming turn rate. And if we're not aiming, we can set turn scale factor to mouse hip turn rate. And then simply scale our value by turn scale factor. So this is essentially the same thing as before. We were taking care of turning with mouse input by simply calling add controller yaw input, and it was taking value by default. Now we're just scaling that value by some number that's either mouse aiming turn rate or mouse hip turn rate. And which one depends on whether we're aiming. We're going to copy this code because lookup will be similar, only we're going to call this local variable lookup scale factor. And we'll be setting that based on whether or not we're aiming, and we'll be scaling value for that. And instead of add controller yaw input, we're going to add controller pitch input. And if we're aiming, we're not going to use mouse aiming turn rate, we're going to use mouse aiming lookup rate. And if we're not aiming, it's going to be mouse hip lookup rate. So now we're scaling the value passed into the add controller pitch input based on whether or not we're aiming. Now, because these scale factors only make sense if they're between 0 and 1, and we're exposing them to blueprints, so technically someone in blueprints could put any value that they want there, we want to limit this so that these aiming scale factors could only be changed to reasonable values. Well, there's actually uProperty specifiers that we can add that will clamp the possible values given in blueprints to these. So for mouse hip turn rate, we want to limit this so that it can only have a value between 0 and 1. So just after our meta allow private access equals true keyword, let's add a comma and do another one. And this is going to be meta equals parentheses clamp min equals, in quotes, we're going to say 0.0. And then we're going to have a comma, clamp max equals, and in quotes, we'll say 1.0. This is going to make sure that we can't have values outside this range. We'll add another comma and say UI min equals 0.0, comma, UI max equals 1.0. Clamp min and clamp max clamps the actual value, while UI min and UI max clamps the slider, the UI in the details panel. So this is really handy. We're going to add this to all 4 of these variables. Not only mouse hip turn rate, but mouse hip lookup rate. We'll add it to mouse aiming lookup rate. We'll add it to mouse aiming turn rate. And we'll add it to mouse aiming lookup rate. Now these are all clamped. Let's compile this. Okay, back in the editor, the first thing I want to see is our new variables here in details. And we have our base turn rates, hip turn rates, but then we have our mouse hip turn rate and mouse hip lookup rate. You'll see that they have the values we set them to, but we can also change them, but we cannot go lower than 0 and we cannot go higher than 1. They're clamped, which is exactly what we wanted. Let's see if our mouse look sensitivity is scaled appropriately. So I can look around pretty fast. The look sensitivity is pretty high. Now if I aim, look at that. My look sensitivity is much lower. So that is exactly what I wanted. This is perfect. And if I want, I can go ahead and tweak these here in the details panel. I can move these down to, say, closer to 0.1, give this a try, and the look sensitivity is even lower. So we can't use values that don't make any sense because we've clamped those with our uProperty specifiers. So that concludes this video. To recap, we altered the look sensitivity based on whether or not we're aiming. We first did this for the key press and the thumbstick on the controller. So if I'm aiming, my look sensitivity is much lower. And then as a challenge, I assigned to you the task of changing the look sensitivity for the mouse. so that you can make the look sensitivity much lower while aiming. In the next video, we're going to continue with aiming mechanics, and in particular, we're going to work on making the crosshairs dynamic. So they're no longer just sitting there in the middle of the screen, but they're going to be changing based on what we're doing in the game, whether it is aiming or shooting, jumping, character movement, things like that. We're going to take care of that in the videos to come, so stay tuned.